Okay, so let's think back. This is the third day in our unit, the third session. So let's think back on some of the what we've done so far for lessons. Okay, on Tuesday, we created all of those charts as a way to generate lots and lots of ideas for what could become a narrative story. And then yesterday, Wednesday, we talked about how important it is for us to kind of climb inside of the story, okay, and tell the story as if we're re-experiencing that situation. That's one of the reasons why we choose something that we actually lived. It's very difficult to write a story about something that you didn't live, because you're only kind of guessing how your character would have felt. If you're writing about something that actually happened to you, you know how you felt, okay? You certainly can add elements of fiction to your story, but you want to try to stay with, or start when you're writing from inside the story, you want to be using what you felt, okay? That makes your story sound authentic. And one of the things we did yesterday was that we looked at a mentor text. We read our Owl Moon, and we noticed some of the things that the author did in that book to help to create this turning point narrative into a story. Okay, we noticed lots of details. We noticed some figurative language. We noticed a lot of description. We noticed that the author stretched out the event by including all of those things and telling that story bit by bit. So stretching it out, even though it was a very short amount of time, it became a story. Now, we're going to look at another mentor text today. I'm going to read you another story because there isn't just one way to write a narrative. That's what makes each story unique and each author unique. So today what we're going to read, and you can put this at the top of your page. You may have heard this story before, but we're going to be reading it as writers today. And the story is called The Relatives Came. And the author is Cynthia Rylant. Now remember, a part of what we used to generate our ideas were some turning points in our lives, some first times, some last times we realized certain things. We also used emotions. We also used special person, special place, special thing to generate lots of ideas. So today, since we've already kind of done this once, you have a pretty good idea about what you should be jotting down, what you're noticing about how the story is written. Not about what is happening in the story, but how is the author telling this story? What craft is the author using? And remember, the how from yesterday, we had lots of description. We had figurative language. We had stretching out the event by telling it moment by moment. Okay, so keeping in mind also what a 5th grade writer about reading is going to be putting down, we want to make sure that we are referring to the precise language of what we were seeing. It was in the summer of the year when the relatives came. They came up from Virginia. They left when their grapes were nearly purple enough to pick, but not quite. They had an old station wagon that smelled like a real car. And in it, they put an ice chest full of soda pop and some boxes of crackers and some bologna sandwiches, and up they came from Virginia. So again, we're noticing lots of little details, very specific details. Not just that they packed a lunch and put it in their car, but exactly what they had in there. They left at 4 in the morning, when it was still dark, before even the birds were awake. They drove all day long and into the night. And while they traveled along, they looked at the strange houses and different mountains, and they thought about their almost purple grapes back home. They thought about Virginia, but they thought about us too, waiting for them. So they drank up all their pop and ate up all their crackers and traveled up all those miles until finally they pulled into our yard. So notice how many pages we're in, and they're just now arriving. So we should notice a similarity between this mentor text and the one we used yesterday. It's the event is being stretched out by including lots and lots of details and telling that story bit by bit. Then it was hugging time. Talk about hugging. Those relatives just passed us all around their car, pulling us against their wrinkled Virginia clothes, crying sometimes. They hugged us for hours. That's an example of something called hyperbole. It's on your chart in your reference packet. And hyperbole is an exaggeration. They most likely didn't hug for hours. It's an exaggeration. Something like, I'm so hungry I could eat a horse is also exaggeration, hyperbole. Then it was into the house, and so much laughing and shining faces and hugging in the doorways. You'd have to go through at least 4 different hugs to get from the kitchen to the front room. Those relatives. And while you might not be able to imagine having relatives travel, you probably can imagine being someplace where a lot of your relatives are. Coming to your house for a special meal, going someplace to celebrate somebody's special day. And finally, after a big supper, 2 or 3 times around, until we all got a turn at the table, there was quiet talk. And we were in 2s and 3s through the house. And you can see from the picture they set up kind of plates of food on a table, like buffet style. The relatives weren't particular about beds, which was good since there weren't any extras. So a few squeezed in with us, and the rest slept on the floor, some with their arms thrown over the closest person, or some with an arm across one person and a leg across another. So they didn't go to a hotel, they all stayed right there. It was different going to sleep with all that new breathing in the house. I love that line. It was different going to sleep with all that new breathing in the house. The relatives stayed for weeks and weeks. They helped us tend the garden, and they fixed any broken things they could find. They ate up all our strawberries and melons, then promised we could eat up all their grapes and peaches when we came to Virginia. So they're farmers. They have a garden. They grow some of their food. But none of us thought about Virginia much. We were so busy hugging and eating and breathing together. Finally, after a long time, the relatives loaded up their ice chest and headed back to Virginia at 4 in the morning. We stood there in our pajamas and waved them off in the dark. We watched the relatives disappear down the road. Then we crawled back into our beds that felt too big and too quiet. Okay, so they're missing their relatives, but they're not really just saying we missed our relatives. Cynthia Ryland is saying our beds felt too big and too quiet. We fell asleep. And the relatives drove on all day long and into the night. And while they traveled along, they looked at the strange houses and different mountains, and they thought about their dark purple grapes waiting at home in Virginia. So notice how we're having some of these details are being repeated. We saw them at the beginning of the book, and notice how they're coming back at the end, and it's slightly different now. Remember, the grapes were not quite purple when they left, and now they have dark purple grapes waiting at home in Virginia. But they thought about us too, missing them, and they missed us. And when they were finally home in Virginia, they crawled into their silent, soft beds and dreamed about the next summer. So you get the feeling that this is something that they do every summer. And so that is the book, The Relatives Came. Now, just to remind you a couple of things. As you continue to develop your narrative story, you want to keep in mind the types of author's craft that we've seen in our mentor texts. Remember, good writers read. They read and they analyze how an author is writing something so they can use the same techniques, the same author's craft in their writing. And that way they can make their writing better. Okay, so, and we can see how we need to make ourselves write from inside of the story. And I got that sense a lot of you were writing outside of the story when you wrote your first narrative in your pretest. You were telling the story instead of showing the experience. And so we need to kind of challenge ourselves to bring our writing to that point. Okay.